The report said, "Friendly fire." 3 words, clean, bureaucratic, the kind of language the military uses when it wants the truth to stop before it starts. Staff Sergeant Mara Voss read those 3 words at 0400 hours in a forward operating base in Helmand Province, sitting on a metal chair with her hands folded in her lap and her face doing absolutely nothing. The room around her smelled like burnt coffee and diesel. Someone had left a radio on. She didn't hear it. Friendly fire. Her team. 4 of them. Petrov, Zhao, DeMarco, and Hale. Hale, who used to do card tricks to break the tension before a breach. DeMarco, who hadn't slept properly in 11 months and still hit every single target at range. Zhao, whose daughter had just turned 3. Petrov, who was so quiet you forgot he was there until you needed someone who could carry 200 pounds up a ridge in the dark without making a sound. All 4 of them called in their grid at 21:47 hours. All 4 of them were in their assigned sector. The coordinates were clean, transmitted, and confirmed twice. She had been on comms herself when they called in, running the satellite relay from the FOB while they executed the ground element. She had heard Petrov's voice, low and precise. Grid confirmed, sector clear, holding for exfil. 14 minutes later, an AC-130 Spectre gunship opened up on their position with a 105mm howitzer round and 240mm cannons. Friendly fire. The AR-15-6 investigation, the Army's standard inquiry for incidents of this kind, was opened, processed, and concluded in 9 days. 9 days for 4 soldiers. Mara had been in the field longer than that on operations where nothing went wrong. The finding, navigational error compounded by communications failure. No individual culpability, no charges filed. Condolence letters would be sent. Medals would be awarded posthumously. Case closed. She read it twice. Not because she didn't understand it. Because she was memorizing every name on the signature page. Lieutenant Colonel Decker, Colonel Haynes, Brigadier General Moreau. She folded the report. She placed it in her breast pocket. She stood up, walked to her bunk, lay down fully dressed with her boots on, and stared at the ceiling for 3 hours without moving. She did not cry. She went very still. That was the beginning. What the report did not say, what it couldn't say without collapsing the entire operational record of that theater, was that the AC-130 had been redirected. She knew this because she had the original flight path in the comms log. It had been cached in the relay system before the server wipe. A wipe that happened 16 hours after the incident. Faster than any standard protocol. She had copied it to an encrypted drive before the wipe ran. She wasn't sure why she'd done that. Some part of her had known before the rest of her did. The gunship was not on a navigational error. The gunship had been given a grid update at 21:51 hours, 4 minutes after Petrov's final check-in, redirecting it 17 kilometers north of its assigned corridor, to exactly where her team was holding. The update had come from the operations center, not a field unit, the ops center where Colonel Haynes had been on watch. She had taken this to Major General Croft the morning after the report was issued. She had presented the comms log excerpt, the timeline, the grid discrepancy. Croft had listened with his hands on the table and his face doing the thing senior officers do when they've already been briefed on what you're about to say. He told her she was grieving. He told her that grief did things to pattern recognition. He told her the data had already been reviewed by the investigation team and found to be within normal operational variance. Then he told her, She was being transferred to a logistics support role in Bagram, effective in 72 hours, pending psychological evaluation. She did not argue. She thanked him. She walked out of his office, out of the building, across the motor pool, and sat down behind a HEMTT with her back against the rear tire and the encrypted drive in her hand. She now had 3 names on the signature page and 1 name from the Ops Center watch log. She started a list. The transfer orders were processed. She signed them. She boarded the flight to Bagram. She never checked in. A sergeant from the 82nd Airborne processed her arrival paperwork 2 days later and found her bunk empty, her personal effects gone, and no record of her having reported to the duty officer. It took 4 more days before anyone escalated it beyond a clerical issue. By that time, Mara Voss had crossed into Pakistan on foot through a mountain pass she'd mapped during a SERE training rotation 2 years earlier. She had $3,000 in cash, the encrypted drive, a SIM card from a phone she'd bought in Kandahar city, and a small, laminated photograph she'd taken from DeMarco's bunk after the incident. His daughter's 3rd birthday. Cake on her face. DeMarco standing behind her, with his arm extended, laughing at something outside the frame. She was not running. She was going somewhere specific. There was a man in Peshawar named Brent, retired NSA, now technically a communications consultant for a private security firm, actually one of the most skilled intelligence analysts still breathing who operated outside official channels. She had used him once during a sanctioned operation. He owed her a favor she had never collected. She was collecting it now. Brandt met her in a tea house in the University Town District. He was 62 and looked 80 and had eyes that had seen everything in the world and was bored by most of it. He looked at her the way he looked at everything, like he was running a threat assessment that he'd finish before the tea arrived. She put the drive on the table. He picked it up. He said nothing. She said, "I need to know every operational connection between these 4 names and anything that touches that flight path update. Personal communications, financial transfers, mission logs, anything that was classified or reclassified in the 6 months before this happened." He looked at her for a long time. He said, "This is going to get people killed." She said, "Yes." He put the drive in his pocket. She disappeared for 14 months. This is not a dramatic statement. It is a technical one. There was no record of her, no phone signal, no financial transaction, no border crossing under her real name. The army officially declared her AWOL after 30 days, then absent without leave under Article 86 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. After 6 months, the file was quietly reclassified as a potential desertion case and assigned a low priority status. Nobody was looking very hard. They thought she was gone. She was in northern Georgia, the country, not the state. A training facility that had been used by private military contractors during a period when certain governments needed certain capabilities without the paperwork. The facility had no signage, no address registered to any entity, and sat at the end of 4 kilometers of unpaved road on the edge of the Caucasus foothills. She paid for the use of a range and a bunk in cash, 8 weeks at a time, through a cutout Brandt had set up. She ran 12 kilometers every morning before sunrise. Then she stripped and cleaned a Barrett M82.50 caliber until she could do it in the dark. Then she went to the range. The Barrett M82 is not a precision instrument in the way most people think of precision. It is a weapon of physics. A .50 caliber BMG round is 12.7 millimeters in diameter. At the muzzle, it travels at 853 meters per second. By the time it reaches 1,500 meters, it has dropped nearly 4 meters and is fighting wind drift that changes by the second. At 2,000 meters, the math becomes a kind of meditation. You are no longer shooting at where the target is. You are shooting at where the target will be, accounting for what the atmosphere will do to the round in the time it takes to get there. She shot at 800 meters first, then 1,200, then 1,500, then 1,800, which is the weapon's official effective range for anti-material use. She was hitting at 1,800 consistently within the first 3 weeks. She kept going. At 2,200 meters, the round was in flight for over 3 seconds. 3 seconds in which the wind could ruin everything. She learned to read wind at distance the way a sailor reads water. Not from instruments but from grain stalks and dust patterns, and the way heat haze bends differently on different surfaces. At 2,800 meters, she began to understand the weapon differently, not as something she was operating, as something she was in conversation with. At 3,400 meters, she hit a static target twice in 6 rounds. The facility's range supervisor, a former Spetsnaz instructor who had seen a great deal and said very little, watched through a spotting scope and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "You are not here for sport." She said, "No." He said, "How far do you intend to go?" She showed him the list, 4 names. The 4th one, at the bottom, had a note beside it. Confirmed location, regular schedule, open roof access on east side of residence, 180-meter unobstructed sightline from the ridge. That had been 3,800 meters away. He looked at the list. He looked at her. He handed the paper back without a word and walked back to the range office. She went back to work. 9 months into her disappearance, Brant sent a message through a dead drop in Tbilisi. A folded sheet of paper inside a used paperback novel left on a specific shelf in a second-hand bookstore near the Dry Bridge Market. She opened it in a bathroom stall. It was everything. Lieutenant Colonel Decker had been the primary author of the investigation findings. He had also, in the 8 months prior to the incident, received 3 wire transfers from a shell company registered in Cyprus that traced through 4 more shells before arriving at a defense contracting firm with active bids on intelligence infrastructure contracts in southern Afghanistan. The value of those contracts increased significantly when the operational sector her team had been running was handed off to a partner unit after their deaths, a unit whose area of operation happened to overlap directly with the contractor's proposed infrastructure corridor. Her team had been in the way, not because of what they'd found, not because of what they knew, because of where they were operating, and because clearing that sector required a level of access that Decker and Haynes had been quietly paid to facilitate. 4 soldiers had been redirected into the path of a gunship because they were a geographic inconvenience to a man who was making money. She sat in that bathroom stall for 4 minutes. She read the document twice. Then she folded it, put it in her breast pocket alongside DeMarco's photograph, and flushed the envelope. She walked out of the bookstore, crossed the bridge, found a bench with a view of the river, and sat down. She had the list. She had the evidence. She had the range data. She had the names. Now She had the reason. She went back to Georgia and ran the 3,800-meter shot 11 more times. The first name on the list was Decker. Lieutenant Colonel Decker had retired 18 months after the incident. His military pension was supplemented generously by a consulting position with a firm that did not advertise. He lived in a suburb of Reston, Virginia, the sort of neighborhood where retired intelligence and defense people go when they want to feel anonymous and still within reach of the machine. She had been watching him for 6 days before she moved. His routine was precise, the way the routines of cautious men always are. Up at 6:30, coffee on the back porch for 20 minutes, regardless of weather. Drive to a gym 3 blocks away, back by 9:30. Into his home office, which had a window that faced the side yard. Lunch at the kitchen table, visible from the street. An afternoon walk at 1500 hours, same route, same pace. He had no security detail. He had not asked for one, because asking for one would have required explaining why he needed it. She was not going to shoot him. She was going to give him a choice first. She put a note in his mailbox on day 7. No name, no return address, just a single line of text printed on plain paper. The AR-15-6 comms log. Cypress shell, 3rd wire transfer. I have all 3. We can talk or we won't. A phone number. He called it 4 hours later. His voice was very controlled. She could hear him working to keep it that way. She said, "I know what you did. I know who paid you. I know how much. I want one thing from you." The name of the person at the contracting firm who made the first approach. Then I disappear and you never hear from me again. He was quiet for a long time. He said, "You were declared AWOL. You don't exist anymore." She said, "Neither do Petrov, Zhao, DeMarco, and Hale. Give me the name." He said a name. His voice cracked on the second syllable. She said, "Thank you." She ended the call. She crossed his name off the list. She left Reston before morning. She did not owe him anything after that. The evidence was already packaged, addressed, and sitting in a postal service distribution center in 6 copies, each addressed to a different investigative journalist, a congressional oversight staffer, a federal prosecutor's office, and 2 international human rights organizations. They were on a 30-day timer. If she didn't send a cancellation signal, they would mail automatically. Decker's name was on everything in those envelopes. He had given her the name. She kept her word. She would not touch him. But if he ever picked up a phone to warn anyone on the list, the timer would stop responding to her cancellation signal. She had told him this. He had understood. The name Decker had given her was Marcus Holloway. Not military. Never military. A procurement architect, which is a title that means the person who structures the money flow in defense contracts, so that the money that is supposed to go to logistics ends up going somewhere else through a series of agreements that are technically legal if you don't look at them the way she was looking at them. Holloway operated out of an office in Arlington. He had an apartment in Georgetown and a weekend house in the Blue Ridge Mountains. He traveled frequently. Brussels, Dubai, Riyadh, the places where the defense procurement ecosystem has its real conversations. He also had a private security detail. 2 men, former law enforcement, serious. He had learned to be careful after a previous contracting dispute that had turned litigious. He was not expecting what was coming, but he was not entirely unprepared. She did not go to his office. She did not go to his apartment. She went to the Blue Ridge house. He was there alone on a Thursday. The security detail came on weekends when he entertained. Thursdays were his recovery days. He went up alone, walked in the woods, cooked for himself, slept without the city noise. She was in the tree line by 800. He came out at 1100 for his walk. She moved parallel to him through the trees for a quarter mile, staying 20 meters off the trail. When he stopped at a clearing he liked. She knew about the clearing. She'd been there 3 days earlier. She stepped out. He looked at her. He was not a small man, and he had the practiced composure of someone who had been in uncomfortable rooms with difficult people for 30 years. He looked at her tactical gear, her HK 416 slung across her chest, the fingerless gloves on both hands, the dog tags at her throat, and something went very quiet behind his eyes. She said, "Marcus Holloway, you approved the payment structure that moved funds to Colonel Haynes and Lieutenant Colonel Decker in exchange for operational clearance in Sector 79er, Helmand Province, resulting in the deaths of 4 American soldiers on November 14th. He said, "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. "You wired $340,000 through Cyprus Marine Holdings to an account in Malta, and then to Decker's retirement account. 3 transfers, 4 months. Decker gave me the account numbers this morning. He went very still." She said, "I have your financial records, your communications, and a statement from a cooperating witness. I also have enough time to wait. What I want from you is the authorization chain above you. Who told you that clearing that sector was worth paying for?" He looked at her for a long time. She waited. He said a name, then another. She memorized them. She did not write them down. She put them on the list in her head, below the names she already had. She said, "The financial documents are already with the federal prosecutor's office. If I cancel the submission in the next 48 hours, there will be no record of your cooperation. If I don't, there will be." He understood the architecture of what she was offering. He had spent his career building structures like this. She turned and walked back into the tree line. She gave him 48 hours. She cancelled the submission. She did not cross his name off the list. She moved it to the bottom. If the higher names had not acted against him by the time she reached the end of her work, she would return to him. But she did not expect to need to. The name she had not expected to find was Kellerman, Captain James Kellerman, Army Signal Corps. She had known him during her second deployment. Not close, but the kind of familiarity you develop with people you trust implicitly in the dark because you're operating in the same space, and they haven't given you a reason not to trust them yet. She found his name in the communications metadata from the Ops Center on the night of the incident. He'd been the signal relay officer on watch. He had processed the flight path update. Not the person who authorized it, but the person who transmitted it, whose hands had passed the order from the senior officer on watch through the system and into the gunship's nav update. She didn't know for several days whether Kellerman had known what he was doing, whether he was complicit or simply a relay point. A man who had transmitted an order he had no reason to question. She needed to know which one. She found him at Fort Meade, still serving, working in a signals intelligence support role. She did not approach him directly. She left him a message through a mutual contact. A vague reference to a mutual operation, nothing identifying, asking him to call a number. He called within 2 hours, which told her he was either innocent and recognized a name, or complicit and wanted to know what she knew. His first words were, "Mara, I've been hoping someone would call. I need to tell you something," she said. "Go ahead," he said. That night, the update. I processed it, but I flagged it. I flagged it to the duty officer because it felt wrong. The timing, the grid change, the fact that it came in from a senior officer on an unscheduled channel. I wrote the flag in the duty log. I handed it to Major Chen, who was senior watch that night. He looked at it. He said it had been verified through the operations center and to process it. I processed it. She said, "Do you still have the duty log entry?" He said, "I kept a copy. I've kept it for 14 months. She said, "Where are you right now?" He said, "Fort Meade, Building 7. I can be outside in 3 minutes." She said, "Don't move. I'll tell you where to go." She met him in a parking garage in Annapolis 2 hours later. He handed her a photographed copy of the duty log. Her name, not a name, but the entry, was there. Flag logged 2153. Reviewed 2156. Authorization to proceed noted. Signed, Major Chen, T. She looked at it for a moment. She said, "You did what you were supposed to do." He said it didn't feel like enough. She said it wasn't, but it wasn't your failure. She looked at him. He was thinner than she remembered. The kind of thin that comes from not sleeping. She said, "Kellerman, is there anyone who knows you kept this copy? Anyone who knows you've been sitting on this for 14 months? He hesitated just slightly before he said no. She said, "Don't lie to me. Not about this." He said, "My wife knows. She's the one who told me to keep it. She said someone would come looking eventually. That was the cost, not his safety. She could work around that. The cost was that someone on the list had surveillance on Kellerman." She found out 2 days later when she noticed the same vehicle. A dark blue sedan, Maryland plates, parked within sightline of his house on 3 consecutive evenings. They were watching him, which meant they suspected someone was in motion. She had to move faster than she'd planned. She had to compress the timeline. She called Kellerman. She told him to take his wife to his mother-in-law's house in Delaware for 2 weeks and tell no one. He did not ask why. He and his wife left that night. The car outside his house kept watching an empty house. She moved to the next name. Colonel Haynes had not retired. He had been promoted. He was now a 1-star general, Brigadier General Haynes, serving in a strategic planning capacity at the Pentagon. He had an office on the E-Ring. He had a driver, an aide, a security detail that rotated every 8 hours, and a reputation as a methodical, thorough, by-the-book officer who had survived multiple deployments and 2 congressional inquiries without a mark on his record. He also had a house in Alexandria, with a back garden that ran down to a creek, and a habit of sitting on the rear deck at 06:30 with his coffee and his tablet before his driver arrived. This was documented in his own calendar, which she had accessed through Brandt 3 weeks earlier. She was not going to use the Barrett here. Too close to the capital, too complex an exit, too many variables. She was going to use what she had on him, which was more than enough. She had the comms log, Decker's statement, Holloway's financial records, Kellerman's duty log, and now a communication thread Brandt had pulled from a private server that showed Haynes coordinating directly with Holloway's firm in the months before the incident. Not about the killing, about the contract, about what the contract was worth and what making space for it would require. He had not pulled the trigger. He had created the conditions. In military law, that is command responsibility. In any law, it is murder. She did not approach him directly. She didn't need to. She had enough. She sent the full package, every document, every financial record, every communication thread, to the federal prosecutor's office in the Eastern District of Virginia, and to a senior investigative correspondent at a national newspaper that had broken 3 previous military cover-up stories. She sent it from a server in Estonia that Brandt had configured to trace back to an anonymous source inside the Pentagon. Then she sent a private message directly to Haynes through his aide's personal email address, which she had because Brandt had his everything. The message said, "Check the news in 48 hours. Then think about whether you want to cooperate with the prosecutor or explain yourself alone. You have one call you can make. I suggest you make it to your attorney." She crossed his name off the list. Brigadier General Moreau was the last name. He was also the most protected. He had left the army 2 years after the incident and gone into the private intelligence sector. The kind of work that exists in the space between government contractors and foreign advisory contracts, and things that don't appear in any public record. He had money from multiple sources, each one obscured. He had connections in 4 governments and at least 2 intelligence agencies that operated with plausible deniability. He had a small staff, and she suspected countermeasures of the kind that people build when they've spent their career around people who know how to find anyone. He had also, she had discovered through 18 months of meticulous work, been the origin point. Not Decker, not Haynes, not Holloway. Moreau had made the first call. He had identified the sector problem. He had introduced Holloway's firm to Haynes. He had designed the structure that moved the money. He had authorized the Ops Center update on the night of November 14th. He was the reason DeMarco's daughter had grown up without her father. He was the reason Hale never performed another card trick. He was the reason Zhao didn't see his daughter's 4th birthday. He was the reason Petrov, quiet, capable Petrov, who could carry 200 pounds up a ridge in the dark, was in the ground at Arlington. He was the last name. Moreau had an estate outside Lisbon, Portugal. Stone walls, iron gate, staff of 4. A private security arrangement with former Portuguese special forces. He moved between the estate and a flat in Geneva, and an office in Brussels on a schedule that was not regular. Deliberately irregular, because he understood operational security the way only people who have ordered operations understand it. She had been tracking his movement patterns for 3 months through Brandt's contacts. Not a predictable schedule, but there were pressure points, moments when his movements converged on a fixed location for logistical reasons that couldn't be varied. His quarterly medical appointments at a clinic in Geneva. He had a cardiac condition that required regular monitoring. The appointments were booked under a different name, but always at the same clinic, same day of the week, early morning. The clinic was on a hillside above the lake. There was a ridge to the east, 3,800 meters. She had been there once before she was ready. She had walked the ridge, assessed the angle, calculated the environmental variables. The lake humidity, the morning wind pattern of the water, the way the autumn temperature differential between the ridge and the valley would affect the round's flight path. She had run the numbers 14 times. She flew into Zurich on a Croatian passport. She took a train to Lausanne. She hiked to the ridge the night before. At 05:45, the following morning, she was prone on the ridge with the Barrett M82.5 0 caliber, deployed on its bipod. The rifle's cheek welled against her face, the crosshairs already placed on the clinic entrance 3,800 meters below. The morning air off the lake was still. A 4-knot wind from the northwest, which she had measured and accounted for. The angle of the shot required a 12-meter elevation correction. She had already dialed it in. She put DeMarco's photograph flat on the rock beside the rifle where she could see it without moving her eye from the scope. At 6:11, Moreau's vehicle arrived at the clinic. He stepped out. He was wearing a dark coat and moving carefully, the careful movement of a man with a cardiac condition who understands that his body is no longer entirely reliable. She settled her breathing. She found the cadence. She was 3,800 meters away. The round would be in flight for 4.3 seconds. In that time, she had to predict every variable: his pace, the wind shift, the terminal velocity, the final drift. She exhaled halfway. She let the crosshairs settle on the space he was about to occupy. She did not think about Petrov or Zhao or DeMarco or Hale. She did not need to. She squeezed the trigger. The round hit the pavement 12 centimeters in front of Moreau's left foot. She had intended this. He stopped. He looked down at the impact point. He stood very still for 2 full seconds, which is a very long time to stand still when you are a man who has spent your career understanding what a .50 caliber round does at terminal velocity. He understood that she had meant to miss. He understood what it meant that she could have not missed. He looked up, not towards the ridge. He couldn't see the ridge from where he was. He looked at nothing. He looked at the evidence of something that had come from an impossible distance and chosen not to take him. He took his phone from his pocket. She watched through the scope as he dialed. She watched his lips move. She watched his security team arrive and begin scanning in all the wrong directions. They were looking at the buildings, at vehicles, at the obvious urban threat vectors, not the ridge 3,800 meters away. Nobody looked at the ridge. She watched Moreau speak to someone on the phone. He spoke for 2 minutes. He listened for a long time. He said something else. He put the phone down. He went into the clinic. She found out 5 days later that the call had been to a federal attorney he had worked with during a previous legal matter. He had offered, unprompted, to provide a full account of the operational decision chain that had led to the Helmand incident in exchange for a cooperation agreement. He had decided, in the 2 seconds he stood over the impact point of a .50 caliber round that had come from somewhere he couldn't see, that being alive and prosecuted was preferable to being dead and having whatever evidence she possessed go public anyway. He was right. It was the correct decision. She had given him the same evidence package she had sent about Haynes, to the same prosecutor, time-stamped 1 hour before the shot. The message she had included with it said, "He will call you this morning. He will tell you everything. You already have what you need without him, but he doesn't know that." She struck his name from the list. She broke down the Barrett M82 in 14 minutes, packed it in the case, and walked off the ridge toward a trail that led to a forestry road where she had parked a rented car under a name that did not exist. She drove to Zurich without stopping. She returned the car. She caught a train to Innsbruck. In a cafe near the train station, she ordered coffee she did not drink and sat with the list on the table in front of her. 4 names, all crossed off. She looked at DeMarco's photograph for the last time. Then she folded the list and the photograph together and pushed them to the edge of the table. She stood up and walked out of the cafe without them. 6 weeks after Geneva, the federal prosecutor's office in the Eastern District of Virginia issued indictments. Decker, Haynes, Holloway, and Moreau, who had cooperated but found, as cooperative witnesses often do, that cooperation and immunity are not the same thing. The indictments were under seal for 11 days while arrest warrants were processed internationally. On the 12th day, the story broke simultaneously in 3 publications. The national security correspondent who had received her package 6 weeks earlier had been holding it under legal review. When the indictments went public, he published within the hour. It was, for one news cycle, the kind of story that briefly illuminates the machinery that most people prefer not to examine. It was not a comfortable story. It named officers and officials and contractors and the specific dollar amounts that had been exchanged for the lives of 4 soldiers. Petrov, Zhao, DeMarco, and Haley were named in the 3rd paragraph. Their original medals, awarded posthumously for valor in a friendly fire incident that was never accidental, were mentioned. Their families were not quoted. Nobody had contacted the families yet. She thought about Zhao's daughter. She was now 4 years old enough to understand that her father was not coming back, not old enough to understand why. She was sitting in a 1-room apartment in Lisbon when she read the story. The window faced west. The evening light was doing the particular thing Atlantic light does in autumn, copper and flat, and lasting longer than you expect. She had been in Lisbon for 3 weeks. She had not spoken to another person in that time beyond brief transactional exchanges. She was not waiting for anything. She had done what she came to do. The legal system was going to do what it was going to do. Move slowly, find loopholes, probably arrive at something less than justice, but more than silence. She had made that outcome possible. That was enough. It had to be enough. Kellerman called her on a number he should not have had, which meant he was more capable than she'd given him credit for, or that Brandt had told him something he shouldn't have. She answered. He said, "The duty log entry is in the prosecutor's file. My name is in there. My attorney says I'll be called as a witness." She said, "Yes." He said, "My wife is asking me if this is going to be okay." She said, "Tell her the truth. It's going to be complicated. Then it's going to be okay." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Mara, what are you going to do now?" She did not answer for a while. She said, "I don't know yet." He said, "You should come back. Whatever they file against you, the AWOL, the Article 86. Given what you've surfaced, I don't think anyone is going to push it." She said, "That's not why I left." He said, "I know, but it's a reason to come back." She sat with that. She said, "I'll think about it." She ended the call. She looked at the window. The Atlantic light was gone now. The sky was a deep, flat blue, the color of a certain kind of late evening that doesn't exist anywhere except coastal Atlantic cities. She thought about Petrov and the way he moved, economic, no wasted motion, exactly the weight his body needed to carry, and no more. She thought about Hale's card tricks, the way he'd do them with the most deadpan expression imaginable, like he was performing a weapons inspection, and somehow that made it funnier. She thought about DeMarco's daughter, cake on her face, a father laughing just outside the frame. She thought about Zhao, who hadn't slept properly in 11 months, who still hit every target. She sat in the Lisbon apartment in the dark and thought about all 4 of them for a long time. She did not go back immediately. She went somewhere first, a place she had been once during a training rotation, before any of this, when she was a staff sergeant running her team, and the future was a fixed thing she was moving toward with both hands. There was a mountain ridge in southern Spain, in the Sierra Nevada range, at about 2,500 meters, where you could see the Mediterranean on a clear morning. She had been there for a winter survival exercise that had been cold and miserable, and somehow one of the best months of her working life because the team had been at its best. Loose, confident, sharp, working without friction. She hiked to the ridge the second week of December. The air was cold enough to see her breath. The Mediterranean was visible from the top, a thin silver line at the horizon, barely distinguishable from the sky. She sat on the rock and looked at it for a long time. She had the Barrett field stripped in the case on her back. She didn't take it out. She just sat there with the weight of it against her spine and the wind off the mountains making the only sound for as far as she could hear. She was not at peace. She did not expect to be at peace. Peace was not the word for what happened after something like this. The word was continuing. The capacity to stand up and go forward into whatever came next, which would be something she had not planned and could not predict, which was the only honest relationship with the future anyone actually had. She was 34 years old. She had been a soldier for 12 years. She was better with a Barrett M82 than anyone she had ever met, including the people who trained her, and she had spent 14 months becoming even better than that in a facility in the Georgian foothills, because the world had required it of her. She did not know what came next. She knew she was still here. She stood up. She shouldered the case. She started back down the ridge toward the trail that led to the road that led to the rest of whatever her life was going to be. The wind followed her for a while. Then it didn't. She was informed through an attorney, one Kellerman's lawyer had connected her with, that the Department of the Army had, in light of the ongoing criminal proceedings and the evidentiary record she had produced, declined to pursue the Article 86 desertion charges. The formal language was, circumstances warrant administrative resolution rather than criminal prosecution, pending review of the operational record from November 14th and the subsequent investigative record, which is military language for, you surfaced something that would be embarrassing to prosecute you for surfacing, so we are going to leave you alone. She read the notice. She filed it. She did not feel vindicated. She did not feel relieved. She felt what she had felt since the morning she had read a 3-word report in a FOB in Helmand province. The particular weight of something that cannot be fixed, only answered for. Petrov, Zhao, DeMarco, and Haley were still dead. Nobody was going to answer for that in a way that changed that fact. She had answered for it the only way she knew, with 14 months of patience and a rifle and a list, 4 names, all crossed off. The rest was up to the legal system, which she had given everything it needed. She returned one thing. Zhao had a sister, older, a civil engineer in Portland, Oregon. They had not spoken about what happened to her team, because nobody had come to speak to them. The army had sent the standard letter. The posthumous medal had been delivered. Beyond that, silence. Mara found the sister's address through public records. She wrote a letter by hand, the first handwritten letter she had produced in years. She wrote it 3 times before she was satisfied with it. She said that she had served with Staff Sergeant Danny Zhao. She said that he had been one of the best soldiers she had ever known, which was true in the way that very few things were simply, plainly true. She said that what had happened to him was not an accident, and that the people responsible were being held accountable, and that she wanted his family to know that he had not been abandoned, that someone had gone back for him, even late, even at a cost she had accepted freely. She did not sign the letter with her name. She signed it with the call sign of their team. A two-word call sign that would mean nothing to anyone who hadn't been there and would mean everything to Zhao's sister if she had ever heard him mention it. She did not know if Zhao had ever told his sister about it. She mailed the letter. She did not expect a response. She had not written it to receive one. 3 weeks later, she received an envelope from Portland. Inside was a single photograph. Zhao on a ridge somewhere. She recognized the terrain as American, possibly Colorado, smiling at the camera with the particular ease of a man who was entirely comfortable with where he was. On the back, in a neat engineer's handwriting, he always said the team had his back. Thank you for proving him right. She held the photograph for a long time. She put it in her breast pocket, where she had carried the other one. She kept it there. The indictments made news twice, when they were unsealed and when the first plea agreement was filed. After that, they became what most military accountability cases become: procedural, slow, and largely invisible to anyone who wasn't paying specific attention to the docket of the Eastern District of Virginia. Decker took a plea. 22 months, no federal facility, a minimum security arrangement that was a negotiated outcome she found obscene, and then, after a day, released her grip on. She was not there to manage sentencing. She had done her part. Haynes went to trial. The trial ran 6 weeks. He was convicted on 2 counts. The sentence was something. It was not enough. It was something. Holloway cooperated early and fully and received what cooperators receive. He went into a business consulting arrangement in the private sector that she tried very hard not to know about. Moreau, who had been extradited from Portugal after 8 months of legal maneuvering, was awaiting trial in a federal facility. His attorneys were excellent. His case would take years. She did not follow the proceedings closely. She had handed the cases off to institutions designed for that work, which was the correct thing to do, regardless of what those institutions would actually produce. She was somewhere else now, somewhere that had no name in the operational record. She was at a table, in a cafe, in a city she had chosen for no reason, except that it had a mountain range visible from the eastern edge of town, and the mornings were cold and clear, and nobody there knew her name or what she had done or where she had been. She ordered coffee. She drank it. She watched the mountains in the morning light. Before any of this, before Helmand, before the list, before 14 months in Georgia, and a ridge above a lake in Switzerland, she had been a soldier. That's it. That was the whole sentence. She had been good at it in the way that only a few people are good at things. Not because she had wanted to prove something or become something, but because the work itself made sense to her in a way nothing else had. The operational logic of it, the discipline, the way a team at its best became something greater than the sum of its individual capacity. The way that in the worst conditions, when everything was failing and the variables had compounded beyond any reasonable response, there was always a next step. There was always a next correct action. You did not freeze. You moved to the next correct action. She had been Staff Sergeant Mara Voss, and she had run a team in Helmand province that had been, by any objective measure, among the best small unit elements operating in that theater in that period. Then one night, someone in an operations center had updated a grid, and she had spent 14 months becoming something that could answer for that. She was not sure what she was now. She was not sure the question had an answer yet. She was 34 years old, The mountains were visible from the eastern edge of town. The mornings were cold. She was still here. The federal prosecutor reached her through the attorney 2 months after the Decker plea was announced. She agreed to a debrief conducted by video link. No recording, no transcript. Informal and deeply irregular. The prosecutor was a woman in her early 50s who had a very precise way of speaking and did not waste words. She asked her everything: how she had obtained the communications logs, how she had tracked the financial records, what Decker had told her in the phone call, the meeting with Holloway, the nature of her surveillance of Haynes, Geneva. She answered everything, precisely and completely. At the end, the prosecutor was quiet for a moment. She said, "You understand that several of what you've described constitute serious federal crimes?" She said, "Yes." The prosecutor said, "The evidentiary package you provided was essential to making these cases. Without it, none of these prosecutions would have been possible," she said. "I know." The prosecutor said, "I want you to understand what that means and what it doesn't mean." She said, "I do understand." The prosecutor said, "Is there anything you want on record?" Informally. She thought about it. She said, "Petrov, Zhao, DeMarco, and Hale. I want those names on record. I want someone who isn't me to say them." The prosecutor said all 4 names, slowly and precisely. She said, "Thank you." That was the end of the debrief. She found the airstrip by accident, or something close to accident, which is what happens when you travel without a destination and let the geography choose. It was in a valley in northern Portugal, about 40 kilometers from the coast. A single strip of cleared ground, once used for agricultural light aircraft, abandoned for at least a decade. The windsock at the end of the strip was bleached white and barely moved in the still afternoon air. The grass at the edges had grown up around the boundary markers. The mountains were visible on 3 sides. She was standing at the end of the strip when she decided she was going to request reinstatement, not because she expected it to succeed. The paperwork trail of the last 14 months was extensive and not straightforward, and there were officers in the chain who would work against it for reasons that had nothing to do with her record and everything to do with what her record now implicated. She knew this. She was going to request it because it was the correct next action, because she had been a soldier before any of this, and that had been true and right in a way she was not prepared to permanently separate herself from, because Petrov would have told her to, in the particular way Petrov communicated important things. Not by saying them directly, but by being so entirely himself that the correct path became obvious. She stood at the end of the airstrip. The windsock did not move. The mountains were close enough that she could see individual ridgelines in the afternoon light, the specific shadows that each rock formation threw onto the valley floor. She was the most capable long-range sniper she had ever personally encountered in a career that had brought her into contact with many capable people. She had a list of 4 names, all crossed off. She had done what she had done, and it had cost her what it had cost her, and it was done. She picked up the Barrett M82 case from the ground beside her. She shouldered it. It weighed what it had always weighed, exactly what she could carry, no more, no less. She walked toward the road at the far end of the strip. If you found this story and it moved you, hit the like button. It keeps these stories coming. Subscribe if you want to be here when the next one drops. She walks until the airstrip is behind her, and the road takes a turn, and she is gone. Like all the best soldiers, she leaves no trace of herself except the work.